Joining us now, Tyson Slocum. He's the research director for the energy program with the advocacy group Public Citizen, here to talk about regulations. Tyson, thank you so much for being with us here today. Chamber of Commerce says we need to prepare for a regulatory tsunami next year. What do you have to say to that? Do you see there being a wave of regulations on the horizon?
No, I mean, no more than usual. And these are all, I mean, on the environmental side, a lot of these regulations are things that we knew were coming down the pike, and they're regulations that are absolutely necessary to protect public health and clean air and clean water. Now, we have to remember that the Chamber of Commerce does not necessarily represent a broad diversity of business interests. They essentially are a relatively small handful of giant multinational corporations that don't necessarily have any allegiance to the United States, to U.S. workers. A lot of them are offshoring jobs to places like China, not because of U.S. environmental regulations, but because of favorable labor markets in China that have everything to do with their massive worker population relative to ours. But the bottom line is that there are a number of businesses out there that actually are demanding some of these tough new regulations because they understand that one thing that the United States needs, particularly on the environmental side, is some regulatory certainty. We all know that at some point we're going to have to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. The Supreme Court in 2007, this was a very conservative, pro-business Supreme Court that ruled that the EPA has an obligation and a duty under the Clean Air Act to regulate these sources. Everyone knows that we have to do it, and because we have been not doing it yet, we've got paralyzed. We've got business investment has been paralyzed in the utility sector. So it's been a net negative in terms of business opportunities because of the failure to regulate greenhouse gas emissions.
You often hear, though, or when you talk about regulations, it seems to be pitted that Democrats are pushing for regulation, that it's going to protect the consumer and be bad for business. But you're saying businesses are pushing for regulation in this field.
Not universally, but a number of them are. I mean, the businesses that are seeking new and innovative opportunities are the ones that typically are seeking regulations because it's the incumbent producers, particularly in the energy sector, whether you're a utility that's heavily dependent on coal, or if you're a petroleum company that's heavily invested in extracting and processing crude oil into refined products, you are benefiting from the status quo. And so if you are a business that seeks to preserve the status quo, you're going to typically fight against regulations that are designed to try to push new innovations, to try to push efficiency, to try to incentivize clean energy. Those are the types of things, and this is the fight that we're seeing right now in the United States, where those businesses that are seeking to get a foothold into a clean energy marketplace, for example, need to see these new regulations, whereas the old dinosaurs that are stuck on older technologies, but they have a huge competitive advantage, are seeking to preserve the rules as they are or even roll them back. And so when you look at the impact that a lot of these regulations have on innovation, I think it's a no-brainer. I think regulations play a critical role in aligning the interests of what the consumer wants, what's good for preserving public health and public safety, and what big businesses want. And it isn't necessarily hostile to all big businesses to implement a series of thoughtful regulations.
President Obama announcing that he's going to be taking a closer look at regulations, that the Obama administration is going to be taking a closer look at some regulations to find out what has been harmful to business. Do you think that's a bad move?
I think the way that he's framing it is a bad move. He is essentially giving in, at least on the rhetoric side of things, to what the Chamber of Commerce and some of the new Republican leadership in the House have been pushing. One example is in this op-ed piece where he says that child labor laws and the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act didn't inhibit progress in the United States. And I would say, I would rephrase that completely differently. I would say they actually were benchmarks of progress, that sometimes regulations are way ahead of where business is. Because if you are a CEO of a major corporation, it is not your duty or obligation to protect the public health, to promote public safety, or even to always guarantee worker safety. Your main concern is short-term value being delivered to your shareholders. And sometimes that's coming at odds with some of these public health and public safety regulations. And so when you look at some of these regulations that are being crafted by the EPA and other agencies, this is a very transparent process. And in fact, by law, they have to do a cost-benefit analysis. So if the costs exceed the benefits, they're not going to move forward. Statutorily, they cannot move forward. So you already have a built-in guarantee that the regulations that are being proffered and developed already are going to deliver more benefits than costs on the economy.
How would you characterize this administration so far, though? Have they been pro-regulation, if you just look at the numbers?
They definitely have done a lot more than what we saw at the end of the Bush administration. For example, on EPA, which is really one of the big flashpoints, is whether or not the EPA should be regulating greenhouse gases and how they're going to do it, and then all of these other corresponding clean air and public health rules on a number of things, from coal power plants to industrial boilers to other things. We saw in the Bush administration delaying tactics on implementing and developing some of these rules. What we've seen from the Obama administration is more aggressiveness in terms of rolling them out and seeking public comments. And they've been trying to correspond those with some legislative action as well. So I think the Obama administration has done a good job in following the law and rolling out these regulations, but they're coming under some pressure from Congress. And now with the big changes in Congress, we're seeing a lot more opposition to some of these Obama initiatives. So he's acting like he's on the defensive right now.
And going back to looking at the year ahead, we've still got so many details to be worked out with Dodd-Frank, with this healthcare reform package. Is the uncertainty going to be bad for business? And or are these new regulations going to be bad for business in the year ahead?
Well, I think definitely the uncertainty, particularly in the energy and environmental arena, is a big killer here. When you've got utilities trying to make decisions over the next 20, 30, 40 years about what types of power plants to build without any knowledge of what the regulatory landscape is looking like in terms of regulating greenhouse gas emissions, that is paralyzing investment. And as a result, reliability might be suffering here. Economic competitiveness in terms of pursuing clean technologies. The United States is not going to maintain its leadership role by sticking with pulverized coal-fired power plants. Okay? We need to understand that the future in the energy sector, anyway, is going to be driven in part by some of the regulations that are laid out there so that businesses can plan accordingly and they can make safer investments. Then we're going to see more capital moving into the industry.
You mentioned innovators siding with more regulation. What are some other reasons that businesses would want to be regulated?
Well, I think in order to just create more certainty over the rules for the industry, and especially for something as capital intensive as energy, with a number of externalities on the environmental side of things, they've got to be very cautious about moving money into different investments to make sure that there's some certainty. You know, the energy sector's been plagued by a lot of boom-bust cycles. It's heavily responsive to volatility in energy prices, and what they need to see is just some regulatory certainty so that we have a plan going forward over the next generation to know what types of investments are going to be permitted and properly incentivized. I mean, that's what the industry is really looking at. And you've got some of the old dinosaurs that are stuck on old coal-fired power plants or in the petroleum sector on crude oil or oil refining that aren't making these big investments into clean energy, and so they're being territorial. They see new rules as a potential threat to their business, but what's a threat to one business model is a benefit to another. And I think we've really got to look long term into where the future of energy policy and environmental policy is, and that's going to be on cleaner technologies. And without that regulatory certainty, we're at risk of really losing more ground to China and other competitors.
And when we talk about, which we haven't talked about too much, protecting the consumer, is there also a little bit of a business angle in there in getting sort of a government stamp of approval? Yes, this is safe, the food safety bill, for example. Is that part of the push?
Absolutely. Anytime that you can have government certification of a certain process or a product that consumers will rally to because they feel that they can trust that product better, that's going to be a benefit. And we've seen some companies push for additional regulations because they experience the benefit of having of being able to show that government seal of approval for their product. And so there's no question that, can we do more to make sure that regulation is as responsive to all stakeholders? Absolutely. But the fact is that regulation, much more often than not, is a huge benefit in the economy. It's a huge benefit for society, and it really adds to quality of life issues. Some of these things that may not show up in the balance sheet of a corporation, but are huge in terms of deciding where a company decides to locate, where families decide to locate. There's a lot of other variables that go into quality of life issues that regulations play a critical role in helping to determine.
Tyson Slocum with Public Citizen, thank you so much for being here with us.